What makes a person break the main law of the taiga? The law that says, don't interfere, don't save, don't pick up, don't tame. The forest will take care of itself. Yegor Matveyevich Sitnikov, a gamekeeper with 20 years of experience, knew this law better than his own name. But on that chilly November day, when the air smelled of frozen pine needles and death, he was faced with a choice that would change his entire life. It all started with a track, a faint imprint of a quad bike tire where it shouldn't have been. The track led deep into the forest, into the middle of nowhere. Yegor had been following it for 3 hours, and a heavy foreboding weighed on his chest. He found her near an old fallen tree. A female lynx, large and strong, lay in an unnatural position. Her front paw was clamped tightly in a steel noose, a cruel, illegal weapon used by poachers. The animal's eyes were already covered with a film of ice. Yegor Matveyevich knelt down. His weather-beaten face was expressionless. He had seen this dozens of times. It was his job, part of the landscape. He was about to get up to report his find on the radio and continue tracking down the killers when he suddenly heard a sound. It was barely audible, on the edge of human perception. A thin, plaintive squeak. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. Yegor froze, listening. The wind rustled in the tops of the cedars. Somewhere in the distance, a woodcock cried mournfully. And again, the squeak. It came from somewhere under the upturned roots of a fallen tree, next to which a lynx had died. Yegor carefully raked away the frozen moss and dry leaves. In a small hollow, curled up in a trembling ball, it lay there. A tiny lynx cub, blind, with its umbilical cord still attached. It desperately poked its snout into the cold ground in search of its mother's warmth. It was doomed. Without its mother, it would either die quickly from the cold that night or suffer a painful death at the teeth of a fox or wolverine. The law of the taiga was simple and clear. Walk away. Don't interfere. It's natural selection. Yegor Sitnikov looked up at the dead mother, then looked back at the kitten. Something flashed in his gray, usually calm eyes, something he hadn't seen in himself for many years, ever since he was left alone in this forest hut. Slowly, almost not believing what he was doing, he took off his worn fur mitten. He carefully picked up the trembling body and tucked it under his sheepskin coat. The warm bundle stopped squeaking and fell silent, feeling the living warmth. At that moment, Yegor Matveyevich, a man of the law, committed his greatest crime. He had no idea that this tiny bundle of life would not only save him from all-consuming loneliness, but would also become the key to solving a mystery that had been terrorizing the entire reserve for several months. Returning to his hut, lost hundreds of kilometers from the nearest habitation, Yegor felt confused for the first time in many years. He took out the lynx and placed it in an old felt boot by the stove. What now? How would he feed this creature? In his bachelor's household, there was nothing but groats, stew, and black bread. Rummaging through the medicine cabinet, he found an old glass pipette. He mixed some powdered milk, which he kept just in case, in an iron mug. His first attempt to feed the kitten failed. It refused to take the pipette, turned its head away, and squeaked weakly. Yegor's calloused, rough hands, accustomed to axes and rifles, now seemed clumsy and awkward. But he did not give up. Drop by drop, hour after hour, he poured the nutritious mixture into the tiny mouth. By nightfall, the lynx finally fell asleep exhausted, and Yegor sat by the stove and watched him, unable to move. He named her Riska, a simple name that just came to mind. Thus began their secret life. During the day, Yegor went out on his rounds, and Riska slept in a felt boot. In the evening, he fed her, cleaned her, and talked to her in a quiet voice that was unfamiliar to him. This little animal filled the deafening silence of his home and his soul. While caring for Riska, Yegor did not abandon his investigation. Her mother's death was not an isolated incident. For several months, he had been finding traces of strangers' activities. These were not local hunters who might have killed the animal out of necessity. No, these were professionals. They used expensive equipment, satellite phones, and night vision devices. They took only the most valuable items, antlers, bile, and the skins of rare animals, leaving mountains of meat in the forest. They were like ghosts. They came and went, leaving almost no clues behind except death. Yegor found their camouflaged huts in the trees, salt licks soaked in chemicals to attract animals, and cleverly hidden traps. He realized that he was dealing with an organized group that felt like it owned his taiga. They were led by someone he mentally dubbed the Master, a man who knew the forest as well as he did, but did not love it. He used it, and this invisible enemy was intelligent, cruel, and absolutely confident in his impunity. Weeks passed. Riska grew by the hour. Her blind eyes opened, and two huge turquoise eyes looked at Yegor. Her teeth began to cut through, and she started to taste everything that came her way. The edge of the table, the strap of a watch, Yegor's finger. She no longer fit in the felt boot and began to explore the space of the hut. Her movements became more and more agile and graceful. The instincts of a great predator were already visible in her games. She could sit for hours in ambush behind the leg of a stool, then attack a ball of thread rolling across the floor with a lightning leap. Yegor looked at her with mixed feelings of pride and longing. He understood that a log cabin was no place for a growing lynx. With each passing day, he became more attached to a creature that by its very nature should be wild and free. He increasingly caught her attentive, studying gaze. She seemed to be trying to understand this strange, large, warm animal that had become her mother. The bond between them grew stronger, but with it grew the danger. What would happen if someone found out about his secret? His superiors? The other gamekeepers who occasionally made their way to his outpost? He would lose his job, the only thing that kept him in this world. But the thought of getting rid of Riska was even more terrifying. One day during his regular rounds, Yegor decided to take a shortcut through an old, abandoned clearing. There he came across fresh tracks, not from a quad bike, from a UAZ. The vehicle had passed through there very recently, churning up the frozen ground. Yegor followed the tracks, and after a couple of kilometers, came to a small clearing. This was their temporary camp. The fire pit was still warm. Empty tin cans and cigarette butts from expensive cigarettes were scattered around. But that wasn't the most important thing. A freshly skinned sable hung from a tree. Next to it lay the tools used to skin it. Yegor realized that he had scared them away. They had left literally half an hour before he arrived. He began to search the camp for any clues, and he found one. Under a discarded quilt, he found a notebook. It was ordinary with squares. Inside were some calculations, numbers, and notes. Kabarga, 3. Elk, 1. Sable, 12. And on the last page was a note in different handwriting, bold and confident. Matvej is on our tail again. We need to calm him down. Matvej, Only his friends called him that. So the poachers had an informant, and they knew his every move. A chill ran down Yegor's spine. This was no longer just a hunt for an animal. It was a hunt for him. He raised his head and scanned the silent forest. For the first time in many years, he felt like prey rather than the hunter. From that day on, a quiet, exhausting war began. The master decided to show who was boss. One day, when Yegor returned home, he found that the window in his hut had been broken. Nothing was missing, just a broken window, a sign, a warning. A week later, he found his salt store for feeding animals ransacked, and the bags of salt slashed with a knife. It was a blow to his work, to his entire life's work. He understood that they were testing his patience, provoking him, trying to make him make a mistake. Yegor did not respond. He became even more cautious. He stopped walking along familiar paths, spent the nights not in winter huts, but under the open sky, covered his tracks like a lone wolf. He knew they were watching him, and he watched them. This game of cat and mouse in the endless taiga required the utmost concentration. But Yegor had a secret weapon, Riska. The grown-up lynx had phenomenal hearing and sense of smell. She began to behave strangely. An hour and a half before Yegor could hear the distant sound of an engine or the crack of a branch, Riska already knew. She would freeze, press her ears against her head, her body tense like a string, and she would begin to growl hollowly, looking in the direction of the threat. At first, Yegor didn't understand. But after the second and third time, when her anxiety preceded the appearance of strange tracks near the hut, he realized. She was his early warning system, his living radar. He began to trust her unconditionally. If Riska was calm, he was calm. If she showed alarm, he grabbed his rifle and took up position at the window. One night, she woke him with a soft hiss. Yegor went to the window. In the moonlight, he saw two shadows cautiously approaching his house. They didn't know he was awake. They didn't know he was waiting for them. And they certainly didn't know that a pair of huge, fierce eyes were watching them from the darkness of the hut, ready to defend their home. That night, Yegor fired a warning shot into the air. The shadows instantly disappeared into the forest. But he understood that the game had moved to a new level. Simple warnings were over. The master realized that this gamekeeper would not be broken so easily, and that meant he would go all the way. The tension grew with each passing day. The taiga, once Yegor's home and refuge, had turned into an arena for a deadly battle. And he was not alone. He had an ally, wild, unpredictable, and absolutely loyal. After that shot in the air, the silence in the taiga seemed deafening. Yegor Matveyevich stood motionless by the window, clutching the cooling rifle in his hands. Next to him, pressed against his leg, sat Riska. A low, guttural growl still vibrated in her chest. She stared into the darkness of the forest with the same unblinking eyes as him. The enemy had retreated, but it had not been defeated. They both understood this. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. The night visitors did not return. The forest fell silent, as if holding its breath. But Yegor was not fooled by the silence. He knew his enemy. The master was not one to retreat after the first failure. He was lying in wait, like a wounded bear in its den, and was now surely preparing a new, more cunning plan. Yegor reinforced the door and began to barricade the window with a heavy tabletop at night. His hut was transformed from a refuge into a besieged fortress. During the day, he combed his property with redoubled caution, trying to find not just traces, but the gang's hideout, He found their traces: a discarded gasoline can, a trap broken by the snow that they hadn't had time to take away. And in these traces, he read anger and haste. The boss was losing patience, and that made him even more dangerous. Riska became his shadow. She followed him around the hut, slept by his bed, saw him off at the door when he left, and met him at the threshold when he returned. The connection between them became almost telepathic. He learned to understand the slightest changes in her behavior. A slight twitch of her ears meant a distant sound that his ear could not yet pick up. A tense posture meant a foreign smell carried by the wind. One afternoon, she suddenly jumped up, ran to the door, and hissed. Yegor listened. Nothing. But he already trusted her more than he trusted himself. He grabbed his binoculars and climbed up to the attic, where he could see the distant clearing through the skylight. 10 minutes later, he saw it, a snowmobile. A lone snowmobile that was not following the official route. It was moving along the edge of the swamp, trying to remain invisible. It was a scout. They were checking him out, studying his schedule, looking for weak spots. Yegor didn't move until the snowmobile disappeared from view. He climbed down. Riska rubbed against his legs, purring softly, as if to say, "I warned you." He stroked her neck. "Thank you, girl," he whispered. "Thank you." The blow came from where Yegor least expected it. Not from the dark forest, but through official channels. One evening, during a scheduled communication session, the radio came to life with the voice of his boss from the district center. "Prokhorov, Matveyich, come in." "I'm here," Yegor replied. Prokhorov's voice was unusually stern. "Yegor Matveevich, we've received a letter about you. It's anonymous. They're complaining that you've let a criminal go free, that you're drinking on duty, and that you're beating animals to death." Yegor was silent. The blood drained from his face. This was the boss's move, a clever, dirty move. If you can't get rid of someone by force, destroy their reputation and get them fired. "You know me, Mikhalish," Yegor said hoarsely. "I know." Prokhorov sighed into the radio. "But paper is paper. The report has been filed. So wait for my visit. I'll be there in a couple of days with an inspection team. I'll look into everything myself, over and out." The radio fell silent. Yegor sat staring at it. He was trapped. An inspection. That meant a thorough search of the house, the warehouse, and the surrounding area. And they would find Riska. They would definitely find her. And that was a direct and gross violation. It was the end. The end of everything. He had 2 days. 2 days to perform a miracle. First, he had to hide Riska. But where? She wouldn't survive alone in the forest. She wasn't completely wild anymore. And he couldn't let her go. The thought of it was physically painful. There was only one option left. The hut. He decided to hide her in the cellar, an old cold cellar under the floor where he kept pickles and potatoes. He lifted the heavy hatch cover. A smell of dampness and earth wafted out. Riska cautiously peered into the dark hole and backed away. She didn't want to go in there. Yegor tried to lure her with a piece of meat, coaxing her, but the lynx resisted. There was fear and incomprehension in her eyes. He had to resort to extreme measures. He threw his old belt around her neck, made a kind of collar, and, overcoming her resistance, literally dragged her into the darkness. She whimpered pitifully. Yegor closed the lid, and the sound struck him in the heart like a knife. "I'm sorry, girl. It has to be done," he whispered into the void. Then the general cleaning began. He scrubbed the floors and shook out all the rugs. He crawled on his knees, picking up every hair, every piece of fur. He hid her bowl and her homemade toys made of pine cones and feathers. The hut had to look as if a lonely, sullen man had been living there for many years, and no living creature except mice had ever set foot inside. The day of the inspection began with a growing hum. A helicopter appeared above the treetops like a huge dragonfly and hovered over the clearing in front of the house. Snow swirled around him. Yegor stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the wind. Prokhorov jumped out of the helicopter, a stocky, strong man in a uniform sheepskin coat, and a young guy with glasses, probably his assistant. Prokhorov shook Yegor's hand, but looked past him. "Hello, Matveyich. Welcome the guests." The inspection began without preamble. Prokhorov and his assistant examined everything. The supply shed, the woodshed, every corner of the house. The assistant scribbled something in a notebook. Prokhorov asked short, sharp questions. "Are the hay supplies for feeding the animals in place? Did you check the tracks on the far border? They say you've started drinking." Yegor answered calmly and monosyllabically. "Everything is in place. I checked. I don't drink." His heart was pounding in his throat. He kept listening for sounds from under the floor, but there was no sound. The fox was lying low. The hour dragged on like an eternity. Finally, Prokhorov seemed satisfied. He found nothing. No signs of drinking, no evidence of poaching. Everything was in perfect order. "All right, Matveyich," he said, putting on his hat. "I see that the anonymous letter was a hoax. Someone has it in for you. We'll get to the bottom of this." He had already turned toward the door. His assistant was waiting for him on the porch. Yegor breathed a silent sigh of relief. He got away with it. And at that very moment, in the silence that followed, a quiet but distinct sound came from under the floorboards. The scraping of claws on wood, followed by a plaintive, mournful howl that could only have come from an animal locked in darkness and despair. Prokhorov froze halfway to the door. He turned slowly, very slowly, his eyes fixed on Yegor. "What's that sound, Matveyevich?" The silence in the hut became heavy, like a leaden slab. The young assistant in glasses looked fearfully at Prokhorov, then at Yegor. Yegor Matveyevich stood motionless, staring at the floor. He had lost, not to the master, not to the poachers. He had lost to this plaintive whimper from under the ground, this cry for help that had betrayed him. Prokhorov slowly took off the hat he had just put on. He walked around the table and stopped right in front of Yegor. His face was impenetrable, but his eyes betrayed cold fury. "I asked you a question, Sitnikov. What was that?" Yegor raised his head. There was no fear or guilt in his eyes, only boundless exhaustion. "Open it," Prokhorov ordered quietly but authoritatively. Yegor silently approached the hatch in the floor, hooked his fingers under the metal ring, and lifted the heavy wooden cover with effort. The smell of damp earth and animals struck his nose. At first, nothing was visible in the dark opening. Then 2 green lights flashed. Slowly, gracefully, and completely silently, a young lynx emerged from the cellar. It was already the size of a large dog, with powerful paws and luxurious tufts on its ears. It blinked, adjusting to the light, saw Yegor, approached him, and rubbed its head against his leg, as if seeking protection. The assistant gasped and took a step back. Prokhorov froze, as if struck by lightning. He had seen a lot, but never anything like this. A gamekeeper and an almost adult lynx in the same hut. It was beyond belief. Are you out of your mind, Matveyich?" Prokhorov finally managed to say, without taking his eyes off the animal. That's a lynx, a wild predator. What's it doing here?" Yegor didn't lie. He had nothing left to lose, and he told him everything. About the noose, about her dead mother, about the tiny, freezing lump he had tucked into his shirt, about how he had fed her from a pipette, about how she became his eyes and ears in the fight against the gang that ruled his forest. He spoke calmly, without emotion, simply stating the facts. Prokhorov listened silently, his face gradually changing. Anger gave way to amazement, and then to something like heavy thoughtfulness. The assistant was busily leafing through some kind of manual. According to Instruction 312, paragraph B, the discovery of a wild animal on the territory of the cordon is subject to immediate seizure and the employee to suspension until clarification. He muttered. "Shut up." Prokhorov interrupted him without looking up. He moved closer. Riska hissed, flattening her ears and baring her fangs. But she did not attack. She was simply protecting Yegor. "Is she tame?" Prokhorov asked. "She's loyal." Yegor replied quietly. "That's different." Prokhorov walked around the hut and stopped at the window. He looked at the taiga, but his mind was elsewhere. On the one hand, there was the law, ironclad and unambiguous. Sitnikov had committed a crime in the line of duty. He had to report it immediately to his superiors, call in a capture team, and send Yegor to court. The anonymous letter from the master had worked even better than he could have hoped. On the other hand, he had known Matveyich for 20 years. He knew how he had lost his wife and son in an accident, how he had fled to the taiga to escape the world, how honestly and selflessly he had done his job. He saw that this beast was not a toy. He saw the incredible, impossible connection between this harsh, lonely man and the wild predator. And he knew very well about the problem with poachers, which the entire district department could not cope with. And Matveyich, it seemed, had gotten close to them. "Mikhailich, I won't give her up," Yegor said suddenly. "She'll die in a cage at the reserve, in the forest too. She doesn't know how to hunt properly. They'll kill her." Prokhorov sighed heavily and turned away. "You leave me no choice, Yegor." He paused. "According to the rules, I have to write now." He fell silent again. His assistant waited for orders. Yegor waited for his sentence. The helicopter in the clearing impatiently shook its blades. "Get ready," Prokhorov finally said to his assistant. "We're leaving." The assistant blinked in surprise. "But the instructions, the animal." "I said we're leaving," Prokhorov snapped. "I'll write in the report that the anonymous tip was unconfirmed. There are no facts, period." He walked over to Yegor and looked him straight in the eyes. "You have time before the big flood, Matveyich. Before the rivers burst and the first all-terrain vehicles start rolling, you have to take them. Do you hear me? Take the whole gang. It's your only chance to redeem yourself. If you don't stop them, I'll come myself and shoot your cat, and I'll rot you. Do you understand me?" Yegor nodded silently. "And one more thing." Prokhorov lowered his voice. "Your boss knows that I was here, and he'll know that you weren't fired. He'll realize that you're now backed into a corner, and he'll strike. Be ready for anything, Matveyich, anything." With these words, he left the hut. 5 minutes later, the helicopter took off, leaving Yegor alone in the deafening silence. He had been given a reprieve. But the price of this reprieve was incredibly high. He had to do the impossible, otherwise he would lose everything. Riska approached and rubbed against his arm again. He knelt down and hugged her. "Well, girl, now we're in this together." That same evening, 100 kilometers from Matveyich's hut, in a sturdy village house, the boss, Arkady Petrovich Voronov, listened to his man on a satellite phone. No, boss, they didn't fire him. The helicopter flew away. Matveyich is still at the cordon. Arkady was silent, staring at the map of the reserve spread out on the table. His cold blue eyes were expressionless. He had expected a different outcome. He thought that Prokhorov, that paper pusher, would cling to the anonymous letter. But he had underestimated either Prokhorov's stubbornness or Matveyich's cunning. That changed everything. The gamekeeper was now more than just a nuisance. He was a wounded animal that had been cornered, and such animals are doubly dangerous. So no more psychological games or anonymous letters. It was time to finish this. All right, he said into the phone. The plan has changed. Tomorrow morning, Semyon will go to Zarechye. He'll find old Pakhom, the hunter. He'll give him money. A lot of money. And Pakhom will tell Matveyich on the radio that yesterday he saw the tracks of a large moose on his property. Wounded. He says it's a young one. It won't get far. It's heading towards the Black Gorge. Understood? Understood, boss. But Pakhom won't. Pakhom would sell his own mother for that kind of money, let alone tell a story to a gamekeeper. Arkady cut him off coldly. Matveyich can't ignore a report about a wounded animal. It's his duty. He has to check it out, and we'll be waiting for him in Black Gorge, the three of us. And this time, no mistakes. He hung up. Black Gorge, a narrow, rocky place with only one entrance and exit. The perfect mousetrap. The next morning, as Yegor was drinking his morning tea, the radio came to life with the familiar, rattling voice of old Pakhom from the village of Zarechye. Matveyich, are you there? Pakhom here. I'm listening, Pakhomik. Here's the thing, Yegor. I was out on the road yesterday and saw a moose. Huge, with antlers, and blood on the snow behind it. Looks like someone shot it but didn't finish it off. It headed toward Black Gorge. It's a shame. The animal will die. Could you check it out? Yegor's heart sank. Black Gorge. Too perfect. Too much like a trap. He remembered Prokhorov's words. Be ready for anything. But what should he do? Not going would mean ignoring a clear sign of a wounded animal. That would be cowardice. It would be a dereliction of duty. Pakhom could tell anyone about it later. And then Prokhorov would never forgive him. To go meant stepping into the wolf's mouth. He looked at Riska. She sat at his feet and stared at him intently, as if she understood everything. He was facing the most difficult choice of his life. Behind him was a loyal friend whom he had sworn to protect. Ahead of him was a deadly trap. And there was no time to think. I'll check. Yegor replied briefly into the radio and turned it off. He stood in the middle of the hut, and the silence weighed heavily on him. It was a trap. He was 99% sure of it. Pakhom, though an old chatterbox, never meddled in other people's business. And here he was, showing such concern for a wounded animal. And the location, the Black Gorge. A narrow stone passage with no way out except the way in. The perfect place for an ambush. But that 1% of doubt wouldn't leave him alone. What if Pakhom was telling the truth? What if there really was a wounded animal in pain? To leave him would be to betray everything he had served. Ignoring the call would give the master and Prokhorov a reason to accuse him of cowardice and negligence. He was in a zugzwang. Any move would worsen his position. He looked at Riska. She stood up, walked over to him, and nudged his palm with her wet nose. Her intelligent eyes were filled with anxiety. She sensed everything. Yegor made his decision. He would go. Not because he trusted Pakhom, but because he couldn't not go. He was a gamekeeper. and he couldn't allow some Arkady Voronov to dictate where he should go and what he should fear in his own forest. It was his challenge, and he accepted it. He began to get ready. He checked his old rifle, stuffed extra cartridges into his pockets, and put on his wide hunting skis. The whole process took place in silence. But as soon as he took the sheepskin coat from the wall, Riska's behavior changed dramatically. She wasn't just worried. She was seized by real panic. She began to rush around the hut like a madwoman. She threw herself at his feet, got tangled up in his skis, tried to grab the edge of his sheepskin coat with her teeth. Then she ran to the door and stood in front of it, pressing her ears back and letting out a low, threatening growl. Yegor had never seen anything like it. This was not anxiety about separation. It was a desperate, primal fear. She was trying not to let him leave. She screamed at him in her animal language, "Don't go! Death is out there!" But Yegor, consumed by his own dark thoughts, interpreted everything in his own way. He decided that she simply did not want to stay alone, that his condition frightened her. "Quiet, girl, quiet," he said, pushing her away from the door. "I'll be back soon. We have to go." He opened the door. Cold air rushed into the hut. Riska made a desperate lunge, trying to jump out with him, but he managed to stop her. With a heavy heart, he slammed the door shut and turned the heavy iron bolt. He heard a desperate, pain-filled cry behind the door. He forced himself not to turn around and walked away from the house. The journey to the Black Gorge took about 2 hours. Yegor walked openly, leaving clear ski tracks behind him. If this was a trap, there was no point in hiding. They were waiting for him anyway. The forest stood silent, snow-covered, indifferent. Not a single bird sang. Yegor moved, his ears and eyes alert. He read the snow like an open book. A fox had passed here. Over there on the slope, a flock of grouse was feeding. Nothing suspicious, no fresh human tracks. This made him even more wary. The master and his men were professionals. They had probably approached the gorge from the other side, where there were no roads, and were now sitting in ambush, motionless, blending in with the rocks and snow. When the dark gap of the gorge appeared ahead, Yegor stopped. He took his rifle from his shoulder. The entrance was narrow, no more than 10 meters wide, squeezed between 2 sheer cliffs. It was a perfect shooting range. He took a deep breath, exhaling a cloud of steam, and stepped forward into the shadow of the rocks. He didn't see the 3 figures lurking at the top of the cliff. 3 men with carbines, already aiming at him. Arkady Voronov, the master, smiled coldly. The gamekeeper was trapped. At that very moment, something unimaginable was happening in the locked hut. Hearing Yegor's footsteps fade away, Riska stopped howling. Her panic was replaced by cold fury. Her survival instinct, which was stronger than any training, screamed at her that her human, her pack, her only source of warmth and food, was in mortal danger. She rushed to the door, scratching the thick boards with her claws, but they did not give way. Then she rushed around the hut, and her gaze fell on the window. Small and covered with cowhide instead of glass, it was the only weak spot in this wooden box. She jumped onto the windowsill. At first, she tried to bite through the thick film, but it only stretched. Then she began to hit the frame with her paws. At first, clumsily, then harder and harder. The wood, old and dried out from the heat of the stove, cracked. At one point, gathering all her strength, she threw herself against the frame with all her weight. There was a deafening crash. The old frame gave way and collapsed with a crash into the snowdrift outside. For a second, Riska froze in the opening, breathing in the frosty air. Then, Without hesitation, she jumped down. She was free. She buried her nose in the snow, inhaling the faint scent of the trail left by Yegor. And in the next second, turning into a speckled flash of lightning, she darted off in the direction he had gone. She raced through the forest, not caring where she went, jumping over fallen trees, driven by a single goal: to find him, to make it in time. Yegor went about 50 meters into the gorge. The silence was absolute. The snow crunched unnaturally loudly under his skis. There were no traces of the moose, not a drop of blood. He was finally convinced that it was a trap. He stopped and slowly began to turn around, keeping his rifle at the ready. And at that moment, a voice came from above. It was the calm, mocking voice of Arkady Voronov. "Well, hello, Matveyich. We've been waiting for you." Yegor jerked his head up. At the top of the cliff, directly above him, stood 3 men. He recognized the master, even from a distance. Next to him were 2 of his henchmen. All 3 had him in their sights. There was no way out. Any movement, and they would turn him into a sieve. "Drop the gun, Hunter," Arkady commanded, "or we'll bury you right here." Yegor slowly, very slowly, bent down to put the gun on the snow. He had lost. It was over. He thought of Riska, who was still in the hut. What would happen to her now? Just as his fingers were about to release the trigger, a sound came from behind them, from the entrance to the gorge, and the blood froze in the veins of all 3 poachers on the cliff. It was not the roar of a bear or the howl of a wolf. It was the piercing, blood-curdling battle cry of an enraged lynx rushing at full speed. The master and his men turned toward the sound for a second, and that second was enough for Yegor. The second stretched into eternity. 3 pairs of eyes on the cliff tore themselves away from Yegor and darted toward the entrance to the gorge, from where the blood-curdling sound had come. They saw a spotted fury rushing across the snow, but their brains, accustomed to being in control of the situation, refused to believe what was happening for a moment. This hesitation was enough for Yegor. Instead of obediently dropping his gun, he did something they could not have expected. He collapsed into the snow, simultaneously pulling the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the silence. The shot went high into the sky, hitting no one, but the roar, amplified by the echo of the rocks, completely disoriented the poachers. In the next second, Yegor was already rolling behind a huge moss-covered boulder at the edge of the gorge, which he had spotted on his way there. He was in hiding. The master's plan was falling apart before his eyes. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Riska, having reached the edge of the gorge and seeing the men on the cliff with their weapons aimed at her mate, did not rush at them. Wild instinct, honed by thousands of years of evolution, told her that a direct attack on 3 armed men would mean certain death. And then she did something that shocked everyone. She veered sharply to the side and began to climb the opposite, steeper and crumbling slope of the ravine. Her powerful paws with extended claws dug into the frozen ground and rocks. She climbed upward at a desperate speed, driven by pure instinct for survival. And her actions set in motion a mechanism inherent in nature itself. The unstable slope, eroded by the spring sun and thaws, could not hold. First, small stones began to fall. Then a large layer of frozen soil shifted. A few seconds later, a small but very dense rockfall crashed down on the poacher's position. It was not an avalanche capable of burying people alive, but it was chaos. Rocks and clods of earth rained down on the rocky ledge with a deafening roar. One of the master's henchmen cried out and collapsed to the ground, knocked down by a heavy boulder. The second, in a panic, dropped his carbine, which flew down with a clang, and instinctively covered his head with his hands. Arkady Voronov himself was forced to press himself against the rock to shelter from the hail of stones. The perfect ambush turned into hell. At the same moment when the stones rained down on the enemy, Yegor jumped out from behind his cover. Now the odds were not just even. He had the advantage. Like a shadow, he darted to the place where the carbine had fallen. He picked it up and cocked the trigger with one movement. The second poacher, coming to his senses, tried to grab the pistol from his belt, but Yegor was faster. A blow to the temple with the butt of the rifle, and the second enemy slumped to the ground. Only one remained. The boss, Arkady Voronov, dusting himself off, looked at Yegor with undisguised hatred. There was no fear in his eyes, only icy rage. "Damned gamekeeper, with your pet cat," he hissed. He made a sudden move, trying to reach his pistol, but Yegor was already close. He did not shoot. He struck him on the shoulder with the butt of his rifle, knocking the weapon out of his hands. The fight entered its final, most primitive phase. Two men, equal in their knowledge of the taiga, engaged in hand-to-hand combat on a narrow ledge. Arkady was younger and quicker, but Yegor was stronger, and his rage was the rage of a man defending his home and his family. The fight was short and brutal. In the end, Yegor, with a powerful grab, threw the master onto the rocks and twisted his arm behind his back. It was all over. When everything had calmed down, Yegor was breathing heavily, pressing his knee against the back of his defeated enemy. He quickly tied all three of their hands with their own belts. Then he sat down on a rock, feeling the adrenaline drain away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness and tremors throughout his body. He was alive. He had won. He looked up at the slope where Riska had climbed. She was carefully making her way down, limping on one paw. She came up to him, nudged his knee with her head, and let out a quiet, growling sound. There was no panic in her eyes anymore, only endless devotion. Yegor hugged her, burying his face in her thick fur. "Thank you, girl. You saved me." He picked up the satellite phone that had fallen out of Arkady's pocket. With trembling fingers, he dialed the familiar number. "Prokhorov, go ahead. This is Sitnikov." His boss's surprised voice came over the line. "Matveyich, what happened?" "I got them." Yegor exhaled. "The whole gang. Send a helicopter and a capture team. Black Gorge, but grab the vet too." The scene that greeted the arriving task force would be passed down from mouth to mouth for a long time as a taiga legend. In the middle of the gorge sat the exhausted, bruised, but unyielding gamekeeper, Yegor Matveyevich. At his feet lay the three most wanted poachers in the region, bound and beaten. Next to the gamekeeper, resting its head on his knees and allowing the veterinarian to examine its wounded paw, lay a huge lynx. It showed no fear or aggression toward the dozen armed men huddled around it. It was simply there with its human. It was a sight that shocked absolutely everyone. Not the fact that the gang had been caught, but how it happened. What the lynx did was beyond comprehension. She didn't just save a man, she showed intelligence, quick wits, and incredible loyalty, which wild animals were not believed to be capable of. The story received incredible publicity. The trial of Voronov's gang became a high-profile case. But the public and the press were concerned with another question. What would happen to Riska? According to all laws and regulations, she should have been confiscated and placed in a zoo. But after the story of her feat became public knowledge, a whole wave of support arose in her defense. Scientists, journalists, and simply caring people demanded that the animal be allowed to stay with her savior. And then, after long discussions and negotiations, an unprecedented decision was made. On the territory of Yegor Matveyevich's cordon, with financial support from an environmental protection fund, a huge rehabilitation enclosure was built, covering several hectares and imitating the natural habitat. And Yegor Sitnikov was officially appointed not just a gamekeeper, but a research assistant and guardian as part of a program to study the adaptation of wild animals. In the final scene, we see an aged but no longer lonely Yegor standing at the fence of the enclosure. He watches as the graceful, strong Riska, his faithful friend and savior, patrols her new safe territory. He broke the law to save her life, and she turned all the laws of nature upside down to save him. Their story forever changed many people's views on where the line between humans and the wild world lies. Who was right in this story? Yegor, who broke the law to save a life, or Prokhorov, who was supposed to punish him but made a deal instead?